Until we are aware of what's actually happening within us, between us, and around us, we're not conscious enough to actually be intentional, make choices, or do anything that might lead to a different way of unfolding in the world. So oftentimes, the initial trigger for awareness is some sort of event that kind of says like, oh, oh, right, this is what's happening. And it shakes us and it rattles us. And sometimes there are costs to that we need to then navigate. But we can also say yes to practices that we explore on a daily basis, a couple times a week, whatever works in your lifestyle, that will start to give us those reality checks along the way in tiny doses. We can like microdose awareness basically in ways where hopefully that avoids the bigger wake-up calls because we've kind of caught it long before.
So what if the key to living a longer, healthier life wasn't about doing more, but about doing what really matters? Today, we're diving into a topic I think that so many of us can really relate to, the feeling of being constantly busy, but not always fulfilled. Hello, my beautiful friends. Welcome back to the Healing Catalyst podcast. I am so excited about today's episode because it's all about how to stop living on autopilot and start creating a life filled with intention, purpose, and meaning. Keys to not only fulfillment, but also to longevity and health. And my guest, my friend, Jonathan Fields, is the perfect person to talk about this with. Jonathan is an award-winning author, host of the top-rated Good Life Project podcast, and the creator of the Unbusy Manifesto. He has spent decades, lots of time, exploring what makes people truly come alive, helping them break free from the endless grind of busyness to craft lives of joy, purpose, and connection. He's also the author of Sparked and How to Live a Good Life. And his Sparketypes framework has guided over 600,000 people toward the work and the life that truly lights them up. In our conversation today, Jonathan shares how intentional living can help us reclaim our time and our energy, strengthen our relationships, and align our work with what gives us meaning, all of which contribute not just to a more fulfilling life, but to better health and longevity. He also opens up about his personal journey with Project 2x20, his plan for shaping the next chapter of his life with simplicity, significance, and joy. And he also gives us 3 tips to stop living on autopilot and instead take back control to intentionally create our lives. So, if you are ready to break free from living on autopilot and discover how to intentionally create a life of purpose and meaning, to transform not just your mindset, but also your health and longevity, this episode is for you. So excited to share my conversation with my friend Jonathan Fields. I'm Dr. Avanti, and this is the Healing Catalyst. Jonathan, I am so incredibly excited and honored to have you on my podcast. So thank you for doing this with me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. We've been friends for I don't know how long now. Sometimes collaborators, and I've had you on Good Life Project like a number of times over the years now. So I'm excited to dive in your home base.
I know. I can't even. It feels like full circle in a way because I was on your podcast once, twice, and now I get to have you on mine. So I'm just really excited. I have been reading your new Substack. I don't know how new it is. Maybe it's not that new, but
it was April of 2024, so it's pretty new.
Okay,
It's like 6 months or something like that.
Yeah, and I have been so enjoying it. I'll make sure that it's linked in the show notes because I think my listeners would really, really enjoy it. Your wisdom, your just observances, and I love everything about it. And there was one that was recent that you titled "The Unbusy Manifesto" that just hit in such a deep place for me for so many reasons. And it was actually very, like the third sentence in the article where you said, "When did we stop choosing our lives and begin defaulting to them?" Where I was like, whoa, I would love for you to tell us sort of what you mean by that.
Mm. And when I write pretty much anything, and that line in particular, I'm speaking to myself as much as I am to anybody else. Like I am human. I have not gotten to opt out of all the suffering and the inanity and all the silliness that we do. It's just like people trying to get through every day.
Yeah.
But it's really this notion of, I think I'm sort of in a reflective season of my life right now.
Mhm.
It took long enough, but I'm getting there slowly by slowly. Um, and just really looking at the choices that I've made, the things that I've done and not done, the opportunities I've said yes to, the opportunities that I've pretended didn't exist, the relationships that I have, the way that I've devoted myself professionally, personally, to the windows and seasons where I've paid, like deep attention to my health, and then others where I just completely and utterly ignored it, like all this stuff. Um, and and really coming to a point where I truly believe that a big part of living a good life is your capacity to be intentional, and to be aware before you can actually be intentional. And I started asking this question. I was like, okay, so if I think about the times where I've gone off the rails in my life, um, when was the moment when that happened? When what was the happening? What was the event? What was the inciting incident? Like the writer in me is always looking for the inciting incident. And what I started to realize is for a lot of them, it didn't exist. It was more of this creeping thing, where like there was never a time where I was like, oh, I choose this and not that, you know? But what I found myself was that, through a thousand tiny decisions and a thousand tiny actions over a period of months, sometimes years, I went from maybe being in a place where I felt really good and in control and having some sense of agency and like showing up the way I wanted to show up and doing what I want to do, to having gone off the rails in a lot of different ways. And it happened so slowly, so insipidly that like there wasn't this big thing that let me realize it was happening until I just chose to be like, oh, wait a minute. I'm not feeling the way I want to feel. Things aren't happening the way I want them to happen. They're not going the way. And I had just defaulted to what was in front of me, like in little tiny ways. Now it's sort of like it's life by a thousand like cuts to intentionality and awareness,
Right.
and I think that's one of the things that affects so many of us in our lives is that we end up drifting from where we wanted to be, where we thought we would be, where we still aspire to be, and how we want to live. And because there isn't this big thing that just knocks us off the rails, like and makes us question what we're doing. We don't realize it until we're like we're we started out on a train heading to Vegas and now we're in Los Angeles and we're like, wait, how did that happen? And oftentimes the way that that happens is eventually there is some sort of major wake up call, whether it's health, whether it's somebody leaving you in your life who you don't want to leave you, whether it's a job blowing up because you're literally like it's really not meant for you anymore, or whatever the reasons may be, and at that point you're like, how did I get here? Um, so I wrote that piece in part because um, I'm always trying to find ways to kind of see if I can create a gentler wake up call for folks than having to be brought to their knees in their lives. Um, I'm not 100% convinced that that's possible, to be honest with you, but I'm always trying. And that was sort of like the genesis of that whole piece.
And so what struck me so much about it is I could identify so much with it because when I got that breast cancer diagnosis, when my body got that breast cancer diagnosis, in February of 2023, I was sitting on the floor sort of like, are you effing kidding me? Like, how did I get here? And what spoke to me and what you wrote was this idea of defaulting to all of these things that sort of just happen every day in our lives. And I was sort of like, oh, I'm in the business of teaching people to be more aware? And how did I, who am teaching people to be more aware with Ayurveda, that's the whole point of Ayurveda, is living with awareness. How have I gotten in this place where I'm sitting here on the floor wondering how this happened to me and realizing that, yeah, maybe I was defaulting in so many ways, in every way, in every aspect of my life because of the busy, busy, busy of the work I was doing. Even though it was something I was choosing, I was also kind of defaulting to all of these things. And I think that that was what struck me so much. And so it's almost like we can be living really aware and making these conscious decisions, but that also can almost become like we start defaulting. I don't know how to explain that. Does that ring true to you in any way?
100%. And, like I've had so many similar, like awakenings where I'm like, and I've spent most of my entire life in sort of like, what could broadly be considered the world of personal growth, human potential, really exploring it from a scientific standpoint, a spiritual standpoint, like all these different things, like, so when I find myself in that defaulted space of having gone off the rails, like a little far enough down the road where I'm starting to feel the pain of it, or maybe really feeling the pain of it.
Yeah.
And then I wake up, I'm like, dude, really? Like, you're the guy who talks about this. You're the guy who's written books about this. You're the guy who's been like spewing stuff about this for years and years and years. You know better.
Exactly.
And here you are. And that's where I think grace really enters the conversation also, because it's like, you don't get to opt out of the human experience simply because you have more information than another person. It doesn't work that way. We are all in it every day. And that means that, we're not enlightened. We're not, nobody's at a place where you know so much that you get to just flip the switch of, like hyper awareness and intentionality and 100% agency and choice and land where you want to land. It doesn't work that way. We stumble and fumble and do the best that we can and try and learn and grow from it. Um, and God willing, we have enough time to keep growing and growing to a place where maybe we stumble a little bit less or we catch ourselves a little bit faster. And we can spend more time the further we progress into like that thing called life. Actually being in a place where we are defaulting a little bit less, where we are choosing a little bit more and being how we want to be and becoming who we want to become.
Yeah. And so, it's like, and you wrote about this specifically, you sort of like added this term of this idea of a reactive life syndrome, right? And this idea of, living on autopilot without intention. And so even though you and I are these people who are trying to live with intention every day, and we're, you know, in many ways trying to teach other people to do the same with that awareness, how do you think we just fall into that pattern? Even though we think we're choosing and we're trying to live with intention, but then we get stuck in this rut. I don't even know how does that happen? How do you think that that happens?
I think it's probably different for every person, right? And what's interesting to me also is we all show up with different histories, different backgrounds, different levels of access, accessibility, of privilege. Um, and yet you still generally don't get to opt out of this experience of what I call reactive life syndrome. It's just the inputs that are seeking to control the way that you spend your days from the minute you open your eyes to the minute you close them at night change. Um, reactive life syndrome to me is a phrase that I coined where it's really about like this experience of living your life as a reaction to the often compounding, overlapping agendas and expectations of everyone else but you. And, so the more you interact with other people, the more you take on as a human being, as a partner, as a parent, as a friend, as a child, as somebody who then wants to contribute in a meaningful way to the world. So you're participating maybe in your own business and organization or practice. All these different things. The more that you interact with the world around you, the more that you are constantly interacting with not just your wants and desires and needs, but other people's and other organizations and then maybe their constituents in the communities that they're serving and that you want to be in service of too,
Right.
right? So this comes at you all day, every day. And then you look more broadly just at the pace of access, that has been accelerating dramatically, largely because of technology, and boundaries tend to get annihilated a lot faster. Tech, which is built upon algorithms that basically are designed to keep you connected for as long as humanly possible, um, make it really hard. So now you're not only competing, with the expectations, agendas, and wants and needs of people around you, but also of complete and utter strangers on a feed on a device,
Right.
and then the agenda of the company that owns the platform, which built the algorithm to keep you engaged for as long as possible, so that that actually feeds their business outcomes. You know, and I think I'm not a Luddite. I love technology. It does a lot to flatten the world. You and I are having this conversation right now through some really cool tech. Um, and at the same time, it has the ability to make those inputs come so much bigger and so much faster. And again, along with the inputs are expectations and agendas. And we have a lot of trouble building boundaries and just saying, this is what I need. This is what I want. And how do I actually interact with all this other stuff, all these other wants and needs and desires that are coming my way? So often it becomes so heavy, so complex, so much effort to try and do that, that instead of it, we just give up and we just react. We're just like, literally, I could spend 48 hours of a 24-hour day reacting to all the other stuff coming my way and still only be half done with
Yeah.
what they want from me.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm just going to give up. And maybe somewhere in the nooks and crannies of my life, I can fit in what I want and need. And this is, in a weird way, it's easier because we don't have to sit there and be really aware and really intentional and sometimes fight for what we want and need in the context of our own lives. We get to opt out of the complexity of the decision making. And but there's a cost to that. And the cost is oftentimes the quality of our lives.
Yeah, that's it's this interesting paradox that I feel like we are faced with every waking moment, which is this desire to do meaningful work, to have vitality, to have connection. I mean, all of the buckets that you talked about in your book, How to Live a Good Life, which I have loved for since the moment I read it, and then I met you at Good Life Project, the Camp Good Life, many years ago, and has been really in the back of my head all the time. And, so vitality, connection, contribution, those are the three buckets you talk about. And I feel like trying to sort of fill those buckets is also the way that we get stuck in this reactive busyness. It's this interesting paradox, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's often, the question that you sometimes is helpful to ask is, for whom am I filling these buckets?
Yes.
And for whom am I emptying these buckets? And oftentimes it's not really, these are your buckets. The simple model is, in life, we have these three buckets: vitality, which is about mind, body; connection, which is about the depth and quality of relationships; and contribution, which is basically about exerting yourself in a way that generates meaning and purpose and play and a bunch of other things, right? And the fuller those three buckets are, the better your life is. The emptier they are, the harder and the worse your life gets. And they all speak to each other. There's no way to just like focus on one without the others. Um, and the more you're spending time filling other people's buckets, because everybody has them, the less time you have to pay attention to yours. Or maybe you think you're filling yours. Um, but at the end of the day, you kind of realize, you're like, wait a minute, I'm working really hard. I'm doing work that is meaningful and significant, but not to me. And then you're like, oh, right. I thought I was filling my contribution bucket. And maybe I'm filling a little bit, but I'm filling somebody else's a whole lot more.
And so, how do you start to tease that out? I mean, because I feel like, I mean, speaking for myself, again, 2 years ago in February when I got that diagnosis, I was sitting there thinking, wait a second. I have been doing all this work because it fills me up. This is the work I want to do. And I've been trying to take care of myself and connect with people. And what went wrong here, right? So it's sort of what you're speaking to. We think that we're filling it up for ourselves. How do you start to tease that apart of like, how much am I doing for others? How much am I doing for myself? Is this really for myself? Is it for somebody else? Is it
Mm.
reactive? Is it proactive? How do you
Yeah.
start to tease that out?
I mean, I think step one is always awareness. Um, and, and so there are a lot of ways that we can tease that out. But until we are aware of what's actually happening within us, between us, and around us, um, we're not conscious enough to actually be intentional, make choices, or do anything that might lead to a different way of unfolding in the world. Um, so oftentimes the initial trigger for awareness is some sort of event that kind of says like, oh, oh, right, this is what's happening. And it shakes us and it rattles us. And sometimes there are costs to that we need to then navigate. But we can also say yes to practices that we explore on a daily basis, a couple times a week, whatever works in your lifestyle, that will start to give us those reality checks along the way in tiny doses. We can like microdose awareness basically in ways where hopefully, that avoids the bigger wake up calls because we've kind of caught it long before. And again, before I go further into this, I also this is really important, I think, to say shame and blame have no place in this conversation. Like this is, I'm not somebody who looks at somebody and says, okay, so you landed here, you did this, like you made these choices. Like, what? I'm human. I'm trying to do the best. Everybody is trying to do the best they can at any given moment of the day. I truly believe that. They may choose differently, they may believe differently, but they're really trying to like show up and do their best. And sometimes we just land in places where there are consequences, and at that point, it's not about like shaming someone or blaming. It's like, okay, so we're here,
Hmm.
let's take a little moment and give grace to the fact that we're here. And now let's just focus on where do we go from here? What do we do now? And for me, you know, awareness practices can be, there are some that I view as long-term practices that build over time. There's some that I view as, interventions or just these fun little ways to sort of drip them into your life where in fact, one of the ones that included in that article you mentioned is a way of almost like subverting tech, the very tech that takes us away from being present and intentional. There are fun, simple, playful ways to subvert it and actually use it to plant the seeds of awareness that over time become patterned into you. And then you don't need the tech anymore. And you just start to walk around the day and you're just like, oh, what's happening here? You're like, what's happening in this moment? Can I zoom the lens out? Like, how am I feeling internally? What's happening in this conversation? Like, what's the subtext here and what's the actual, like surface thing that's going down. And I found that the blend of sort of long-term practices that grow over time with more short-term fun, sometimes even playful practices that are accessible to anybody, and you don't really have to practice to get the benefit of them, can be super helpful in sort of like starting to plant the seeds of this awareness that let you then say, okay, I have a much better beat on what's going on in my life on a regular basis. And I can then that becomes a gateway to intentionality, to choice, to like stepping into your life with much more agency.
Yeah, I think that this is where it's so interesting because what you're talking about is exactly what we talk about in Ayurveda, right? Ayurveda is about living with awareness, conscious awareness. Whenever someone asks me, like, where do I start? I really want to dive in. I'm like, start by just being aware. They're like, well, what does that mean? I'm like, just be aware of why are you making the choices you're making? And why are you making the choices that you're not making? they're choosing not to make, why is that, right? Start there and then go from there. And so when you're talking about these three buckets, right? Vitality, connection, contribution, maybe you could share with us, sort of what are some different practices that you've sort of leaned into over so many years of writing about this and thinking about it. And, as you also, talked about in another Substack article, you talked about your project 2 by 20, which I would love to talk about, sort of your thinking about your next phase of life, which is where I am too. How do you start? So, I mean, I asked you like three questions in one. So let's first start with what is Project 2 by 20? And then let's go into sort of, how are you applying, sort of stepping into this awareness and these practices and these different buckets, or how are we
Cool.
going to?
Can I reverse those? Can I go audible
Please,
and reverse those?
please.
Okay.
Yeah,
Let's start with some just like simple practices, and
yes,
then we'll sort of like zoom forward to 2 by 20.
yeah,
So if I think about some of the practices, that it can be a blend of awareness and or intentionality that relate to each one of these three buckets. So let's start out with the vitality bucket, right? This is all about mind body. Of course, we don't say mind and body anymore because we know, you know, they're not two different things.
exactly.
As everyone who's like listening to you and has been listening to you knows really well, because I'm sure you've spoken about, like, it's all one
Yes,
seamless thing. And
yes,
a lot of people would probably also make the argument that even mind body is not really separate from the environment around us. Like, we are one fluid organism, right? So, what are some of the things that we can do? Well, if I relate it directly back to, let's say, an awareness practice, I think one of the big things that makes a huge difference, and everybody's been talking like about this nonstop for years now, is a mindfulness practice. Um, and I'm not going to belittle that. That is my daily practice. It's one of the things that are part of my daily practice. It has been transformative for me. Probably going on about 15 years now. And it started for me because I have something called tinnitus, which is like a sound that my brain generates, only I can hear. In the early days, I perceived it as being extremely loud and disconcerting, alarming to the point that it was paralyzing for me. And eventually, after trying everything, realizing that this was going to be me for life, I said, well, if this is me for life, what do I do about that? Can I find a way to actually be okay and live my life, knowing that there's this thing in my head, potentially for like till my last days? And I turned to mindfulness and adapted the practice. I had been teaching yoga and meditation. Again, this notion of you don't get to opt out of these just human experiences simply because you know this stuff,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And I was like, all right, so how do I do this? And I adapted the practice so that basically I effectively retrained my brain to be able to let go of the sound that it was generating inside my head, to the point where now, because of the practice, like, goal number one for me was simply um, stop being able to actually stop focusing on the sound and only the sound all day, every day, and well into the night when everything fell away. And it just put me into like an anxiety death spiral. Uh, Over a period of months, that happened. I was able to actually get my brain to a place where it could let go of it. And in let going of it, it also created the space to then start to experience and become more aware of life again outside of the sound in my head, the people, the relationships, all the other stuff going in my mind and body, like my businesses. Um, so it started as something that was really designed to kind of save me, brought me back to baseline, and now has become this gift in my life that allows me so many opportunities to just pause, like all these different moments throughout the day, and just notice like what's actually happening here. Like, why am I breathing like really shallow in my chest? Like, why is this feeling in my belly? What's happening in this conversation? Like, if I'm hiking, I'm in Boulder, Colorado, just like, instead of spinning in my head for, like an hour and a half to 2 hours while I'm in stunning nature, just being there, like noticing the sounds and the smells and the scents and just stopping, in the middle of a hike, and like not checking whether I'm logging my steps appropriately or going to like my elevation goal and just being like, damn, this is gorgeous. Um,
Mhm.
so that practice I think is really powerful. And there's so many different ways. It's like everybody has access to that now. Like, there's so many guided audios, meditations. Um, but I think a more fun one, and this is probably, I think I wrote about this in that article that you mentioned also, but I would consider this a part of the vitality bucket. And this is that way to sort of subvert your tech, is what I call creating awareness triggers. Um, so basically, like, everyone has a device now. On that device, everyone has an app that is some form of timer, or like you can set snooze alarms, wake up alarms, alerts, whatever you want, and so the fun invitation here is, like, take that device, open your timer app, um, and then set a series of vibration alerts, not sound alerts, right? Because you want just a vibe alert, and choose a pattern that's different from whatever you have for your regular calls, your texts, and stuff like that. So you kind of know what it is, if it's on your desk or in your pocket and you feel it. And then set about a dozen of those, like, to repeat every day. You can do it on the hour if you just want to make it easy, random times. And when you feel this, when you feel the vibration, like, it's really simple. You feel it, you notice the sensation of it, right? And then just for a few seconds, you kind of like notice what's happening inside of me. How do I feel? Right. And then you kind of notice what's happening outside of me, what's around me. Like, what do I perceive? Do like a 5 sense check. What do I see? What do I smell? Like, what do I taste? Right. Um, and then if you want, you can also just say, like, what's happening in my head right now? Am I spinning about something? Am I calm and balanced and focused? And this is actually not about changing any of what
Right.
you're perceiving.
Yes.
This is not a job that you're giving yourself to be like, oh, I'm not supposed to be thinking that. Like,
Right.
this is simply about noticing.
Hmm.
Like, that is the only thing we're doing here. Um, and what happens is you start to become just much more regularly aware on a momentary basis. So it's literally 10 seconds. You're like, oh, there's all this stuff going on that I had completely tuned out because I was, like, just focusing on X, right? Now, when this happens like a dozen times a day, and then you do that for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, it just becomes a patterned behavior, and you actually don't need the alerts anymore. It's like Pavlov's dog,
Right.
but instead of salivating, you become aware.
Yes. Yeah.
And that can be, it's fun. Anyone
Hmm.
can do it. And it really starts to make a difference in what you're noticing in your life, and then gives you the ability to then, after that, if you want to, choose to be intentional about making a change. So that's a fun one for the vitality bucket. The connection bucket, there's so many different things here. I'll give you kind of like a goofy fun one also that subverts technology. Like, let's
Love it.
reclaim technology from
Let's do it.
being the thing that just, like,
Yeah.
distracts us and takes us away from human beings. This is something I call text roulette. So on a pretty regular basis, I'll take out my device, I'll open my messaging app, I'll hold it up, and I'll just take one finger, I'm gonna give it a really hard flick. And so you're going to see it, it's like the slot machine, right? It just, like, flies by, and then it's going to land on a message from a person.
Yeah.
That may be, like, a person that I talked to an hour ago, and maybe a person that I talked to 3 months ago. It may be a person it'd be fun to be back in touch with. It may be a person where I don't so much want to be back in touch with them.
Yeah.
There may be a good reason for that,
Roll the dice. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And then you look at that, and you're like, okay, so maybe if it's that person where, like, there's a reason you're not in touch with them, just flick it again. unless unless you're like, you know what? Time has passed. Maybe it's time to open that door again. Right. But the goal here is, like, you look at the name, and if it feels healthy to you, you just send them a quick message, which is just like, hey, thinking of you. I hope you're well. I cannot tell you how many times that has led to beautiful updates and conversations with friends, with family members, with, like, professional acquaintances where we've been out of touch. And then that's led to, hey, let's meet up. It's been too long. And that's all of a sudden you're like, I really love having this person more regularly in my life. It is the simplest, dopiest little thing, and it works beautifully. And it's like, it's not a heavy thing. It's the type of thing where, again, anyone can do it. So that's, I think, a fun way, to just put these little drops to fill your connection bucket. Um, if we move over to the contribution bucket, let me think about this one a little bit more. There's an obvious answer for me, which will be a little bit self-serving too, which is to discover your spark type.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, um, So I'll just go there because I think it's one of the most powerful things that you can do, both on an awareness level and intentionality level. So we spent years developing an archetyping system that basically identified a set of archetypes for work that makes people come alive. Like everybody has a profile, some blend of them. And then we spent a large chunk of time developing an assessment around these also. We call them sparketypes because it's just a fun way of shorthanding, the archetype for work that sparks you. And that's freely available for anyone to take online, by the way. And basically, what it identifies is the underlying impulse of effort, whether that effort is exerted for play, for work, whatever it is. It's just anything that asks you to exert effort in a meaningful way over a sustained period of time, right? And and effort in a way that gives you the feeling of purpose, of meaningfulness, of excitement and energy, of easier access to flow, and also more fully expressed potential. Um, we've had about 1 million people complete the assessment now, so we're sitting on a database of 50
Wow.
million data points. So,
Oh,
like,
so
we know a lot, you know.
yeah.
We can, and we also know that the assessment is pretty accurate. For I think 92% or so of people say it's very too extremely accurate in helping them really understand this. So I think on the awareness side, when it comes to contribution, the step that we tend to skip is the awareness step. And we're just like, we're like, what job should I do next? Like what role, what company, what industry? And we start looking at lists of jobs and lists of companies. Oh, and then oftentimes it's like, ooh, that's sexy. Ooh, that's a great paycheck over there. Ooh, this is going to really help me get 5 steps further on my resume. These things matter. Like, I'm not going to just say like none of that matters. Of course it does. If we're trying to build a trajectory with our sort of like the contribution oriented around our career in particular. Um, but if they're not built upon a fundamental understanding of what kind of effort or work makes us come alive, it's always hollow. You're checking all the boxes, but you're never actually filling your contribution bucket. So you may find yourself, like 10 years down the road with a fancy title, a great, great company in a hot industry, a fantastic paycheck and benefits and a 401k. Again, those things are all really nice to have. We all aspire to it, but still feeling empty and wondering what's happening here. I literally got everything that I said I wanted, and I don't feel the way I want to feel. Now, there are probably a bunch of different reasons, but it's my belief that a core reason for that for a lot of people is that they never actually did the work to understand what is the fundamental impulse for effort that makes them come alive, and then align the way that they step into their work in a way that lets them center that in the work that they're doing. And by the way, this applies again equally to you may be somebody who actually has a quote paid career path. You may also be a full-time parent or a caregiver, or this is all about that also. If you're a parent, you can show up in a lot of different ways as a parent. You can sort of like lead as a parent in different ways. Like you're one of the archetypes is the maker, which happens to be my lead one, which is all about the process of creation. So I can be a parent by just like really just creating all sorts of really cool things and magical experiences like with my kid. And on the other hand, one of the types is the sage, which is all about inciting insight and illumination. Like I know something and I can't wait to share it with you.
Yep.
So can be the parent that's just constantly like
Hmm.
creating experiences for your child to learn amazing things that really tickle their interests and stuff like this. And you may do all of that as a parent, but you also will probably realize that certain of those modes come more naturally to you and more exciting to you also, and let you show up in a really energized and electric way. Your kids seeing you model that energy is also a really powerful, subtler message to them. So that's sort of like one of the ways I would think about the something on the awareness thing as a practice for the contribution bucket.
Yeah, and that's bringing up so much for me. All of the practices that you talked about in each of those three buckets speaks to so much of what we do in Ayurveda, which is, this connection piece with, how am I feeling in my body? What are the thoughts that are coming up? What am I feeling in my body? And that gives you so much awareness about, are you close to your natural state of balance, which is, sort of that sweet spot of where you can exist in health and vitality, right? And then even with, the connection, our relationships, so are a part of our overall health. I can't tell you the number of people that when I say to them, well, let's look at your relationships. How is that affecting your health? They kind of are like, wait, I never thought about that. Right. And it's such a big part of our health. It's such a big part of our stress response and how we view ourselves, how we view the world. Right. And so it has an impact on our health and even the contribution piece. Right. There are things based on your dosha type, on your, sort of natural state of balance that are going to light you up more and that are going to come more naturally to you. And when you're fighting uphill, sort of, rowing the boat upstream all the time because you're trying to fit yourself into a way of being in the world and of doing things in the world and contributing to the world that is not exactly your natural sort of state of balance or comes naturally to you, it's a lot harder, right? And so I think that these are so many things that are so valuable, especially when we're talking about health. But even let's take it one more, step further, with longevity. I wrote this new book on longevity, and one of the biggest things that I came away with, and I think I knew this, but it was a very personal journey writing this during a breast cancer journey, is the connection piece, but the purpose piece. Those two for me were such a huge revelation of like, oh my gosh, these are actually the two things that matter the most in our longevity. We can eat all the clean food and, be out in nature. Those are all really important things. But if we're not connected to other people and connected to a purpose, longevity is really hard. It's really, really hard.
Yeah, I mean, that makes so much sense to me, and, from an Ayurvedic standpoint, I totally get that, and then there's now tons of research from a Western medicine and a scientific standpoint also that absolutely validates that, and I think people are becoming more aware of the research around connection, but maybe not around purpose. And a
Right.
lot of the research that's actually been done around purpose is actually coming out of the business world,
Exactly.
which is why maybe people aren't really keying in on it on a more personal level.
Hmm.
But because they're sort of like measuring like how people show up more productive and more
Right.
generative and like blah blah blah, all the stuff that a business or a leader might want from their people, and like, oh wow, purpose
Right.
matters here. But it's also, it affects everything from like levels of systemic inflammation to all cause mortality to like literally having like, and it doesn't have to be like a capital P1 unifying life purpose,
Of
just a
course.
sense of purpose as you move through each
Exactly.
day
Yep.
really has a huge difference.
Yeah. I mean, because, for many of my elders, and maybe you've had this experience too, for them, purpose might just be being available to their family and being able to share their stories and their life experiences. That could be their purpose, which is, in South Asian culture, it's hugely important to a family structure. For me to be able to glean that wisdom and those experiences from my elders is so important, and it gives them a sense of purpose, right? Long after they've sort of, retired from, work that makes money or, in some way sustains livelihood, it is a sense of purpose that can carry you into that next phase of life, which is, so much of what I've been thinking about. What is my next phase of life and how is this going to continue my purpose, my dharma, if you will?
I so agree with that. It's funny. I was just having a conversation with a friend recently on a hike, as kind of like you do out here in the mountains. It's like everything happens on a hike.
Yeah.
But we were talking about the phenomenon of how, just a generation or two ago, a kid would often, if they chose to go off to school, very often they return like to the same neighborhood or at least local enough where it was like, hey, we can see each other like on a daily or like a couple times a week. Now, very often, sort of like the current generation, including like our generation, like Gen X, we kind of broke that pattern. And now a lot of times we don't return to the place where like we grew up or the place where our parents are, or our parents now are somewhere else if, we're fortunate to still have them with us. And then our kids, like often then go somewhere completely different. So it's like the pattern of multi-generational home or even sort of like local community where it's part of your family, it's been blown up for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And we were talking about, you wonder what are we losing from that? And certainly there's a lot of wisdom transfer that we lose from that. But also in the older generation too, it's what you were just describing. Like you wonder, it's like, okay, if a lot of purpose gets derived, especially in your later years, from being there for like close family or even chosen family, and knowing that you can contribute to their lives in a meaningful way, and being really geographically distant and probably less connected, it makes it that much harder. Like, what is that doing? What is that taking from everyone?
Yeah. And so I think this is where, the technology is sort of this double-edged sword, right? Because while it connects us, but also takes us away from actually connecting with humans in a meaningful way, and instead connecting with algorithms all day and the needs of everybody else, it's this delicate balance because that connection can be so incredibly important. My parents, being South Asian, first, they came from India. They have these huge WhatsApp groups that, are their whole family, and they're sending, birthday wishes and Diwali wishes and this and that and sharing stuff. And, at first I was like, God, this is so annoying. There's like 300 people on this text message thread and it's like pinging all day. And then I started to realize, oh no, this is them connecting in the way that they would have if they were all living in the same neighborhood, as you said, stopping in to have chai with each other, or talking about the latest wedding or this or that or whatever was happening. This is the way that they're doing that. And so it's so incredibly important for that sense of purpose, because they're giving each other advice over this family text message. It's really incredible. And I actually had that experience, during the breast cancer journey. My sister and my husband Kunwar, they set up a WhatsApp group for us to be able to give updates to all my friends and family. And we just invited anybody who wanted to be on it. And there were like 300 people on there. And what I found is that it was a way for everybody to connect with each other so much more than learning about what was going on with me in my life. It was people from every stage of my life. And so when you were talking about doing the flick of, through your text messages and then just sending a message, I almost feel like that WhatsApp group provided that, because college friends were connecting with each other who hadn't talked to each other in a long time, or childhood friends or family members. And people were supporting each other in this really interesting way, even though the connector was me. So I feel like there's these beautiful ways to use technology to really help us with this awareness, this connection, all these buckets that you're talking about.
Yeah, 100%. Like as you're describing it, weirdly enough, I had like a flash of like the scene around the kitchen from the movie The Big Chill, which is like part of my childhood, and that's part of what you're just like back then. It was like it was an unfortunate circumstance. Like one of the original crew had been lost, so all these friends who hadn't talked for like years and years and years come together, just like in a house. And tech can be that, like if we use it intentionally in that way and at scale. We can flatten the world where we don't actually have to go on trains, planes, and automobiles. Is it going to be the same as being in the same room together? Of course not. But is it going to be a whole lot better than just not being in communication at all? Yeah.
Yeah, it's so many paradoxes, right? To the technology. I find it so challenging because there are so many of these beautiful things, but then there's so many of these destructive things. It's like it's almost like you have to have such awareness to be able to use technology in this way that it adds to your life and doesn't take away from it.
Yeah. So agree.
Yeah. Can we really quickly touch? I know we're almost out of time, but that your 2 by 20 project?
Sure. Sure. So, yeah. So when it's about a year now, actually, ago that I started this thing called my 2 by 20. And I had just turned 58. And and something in me was like, oh, I'm 2 years away from what feels like a big number for me. And granted, of course, I'm gonna say like 60 is the new 40, blah blah blah. But
It is.
um, you know, and I just started examining the three different buckets basically, and I was like, am I being aware? Am I being present? Am I being intentional? And is what I'm doing, the way that I'm behaving, the choices that I'm making, the people that I'm interacting with that I have in my life, are they making me feel the way that I want to feel? And if so, great. If not, like how, how would I want to change that? And then I started thinking, okay, so I'm 58. I'm going to turn 60 in 2 years. And uh, maybe if I'm really fortunate, like I have another 20 years of like meaningful contribution in my life. Like that's going to be like, I think the season for me. And like maybe it's like five and then another five, and I change gears. But like I kind of look at that as like, that's a season. That is, maybe I'm given a whole lot more time. I'm not somebody who thinks about retirement. The reason I don't think about retirement is because I like working.
Yeah.
I like exerting myself. Like I
Mhm.
know myself well enough to know that I know what kind of work makes me come alive and edges me out. And I can't imagine wanting to just hit an age where I'm like, I'm going to stop doing that simply because I hit an age because I actually enjoy doing it. Not all of it all the time, but like chunks of it. So I don't look at this as like, oh, like, that's my final season of retirement. Like, no, like I plan on contributing and working in some kind of meaningful way for as long as I can because I like to. Not because, like I'm pushed to or I'm forced to, but I like to. And if most people are really being honest, if their effort is aligned with who they are and what makes them come alive,
Yeah.
they would feel the same way. Right. So I started asking, what would I learn, do, or build in the next 2 years that might set up my next 20 years to center more simplicity, more significance, and more joy? And I looked at everything that I'm doing now, and I was like, is that giving me what I want? Is it making me feel the way that I want to feel? And some of it was yes, and some of it was no, and some of it was like, okay, so this I could see myself continuing on sustaining for a long window of time, and this it's fine now. Um, but I don't see this as being the thing that's actually going to really sustain me as I move into the next season. And because the metric for me was, can I see at least the potential for this being a source of simplicity and significance and joy for 20 years? What it did was it gave me a metric that allowed me to say no to tons of things that I would have normally said yes to. Doesn't mean that these things actually have to give that to me, but I need to at least see some potential for them to be able to give that to me. And then the 2 year window just happened to create a really interesting container of what I would call generative tension. So it's long enough for me to run a series of experiments to learn a lot. I can learn a lot in 2 years. I can do a lot in 2 years. And if it
Mhm.
makes sense, I can even build a lot in 2 years.
Yeah.
Um, but it's short enough so that I can taste the end, and that I feel a sense of generative tension, meaning not tension in terms of like pressure or stress that is scaring me or causing anxiety or paralysis or shutting me down, but it's sort of like, I want to use this time well. Like it's going to end. I'm about to be a year into it, like as we have this conversation. And I've run a lot of experiments already. Some of them have yielded awesome insights that I'm like deepening into. And some are like, oh, that was really good. Like that took 3 months and I'm 100% not going to follow anything that I started doing, but that's great information for me. Now I can cross that off my list. And it really is helping me um, get a lot of ideas about how I want to step into this next season. So for me, probably in the next few months, I'll start to add more building to the learning and doing part of this project, because the learning and doing is yielding enough insight and data for me to have like better and better sense of what I then want to build. And I do want to build some new things for the next season, and how I want to do that. Literally, as we have this conversation, I'll share one fun experiment.
I would love it. Yes,
So,
please.
so I'm a writer. I've written a
Yeah.
bunch of books, generally all nonfiction, prescriptive.
Mhm.
But for me, for years, I'll be like sitting on the couch or listening to an audiobook like James Patterson, David Baldacci, Harlan Coben, thrillers, like police procedurals. And I annoy the heck out of my wife and daughter because I'm like, oh, this is about to happen. Oh, this is about to happen. Oh, this is about to happen. they're all pretty formulaic. So like you listen to enough, you kind of know what's coming.
Yeah.
And they're like, Dad, just write a damn book already. Like write like one of these things, write some fiction.
Yeah.
And for years I've been like, oh, I think there's fiction in me. It terrifies me. I know nothing about writing fiction. It is an entirely different beast than
Totally.
writing any kind of like information or how-to book. So so I was like, this is probably like I'm in my 2 by 20. How can I run an experiment that might actually tell me if this is even legitimately interesting to me, or if I have any chops at it, or maybe writing novels might become a part of the 20 that follows the two for me. I have no idea. So I'm literally just starting like a 30-day intensive project to try and generate a really horrible first draft of an idea that I have for a novel. I might quit a weekend. I might go like all 30 days. Even if I make it to 30 days, it will be 100% awful, guaranteed already from the start. But it'll teach me something, and it'll give me like a hint of like, is this interesting to me?
Yeah.
So it's just a series of running all these experiments. And the goal of the experiment is not, I must succeed. The goal of the experiment is just like, am I learning something from this that might be valuable as I think about like this next season that I'm building into?
It's like this great container to just try a bunch of things and throw a bunch of spaghetti at the wall and see what
Totally.
sticks, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly,
see
exactly.
what does my next era hold for me? And
Yeah, and it's long enough also so that I can do a whole bunch of things that kind of don't end up being interesting to me, and I still have plenty of time to try a whole bunch of to run more experiments.
yeah. Wow. So that feels like a good place for us to come full circle as we're talking about sort of next era longevity. My new book is called The Longevity Formula. In your experience, what do you see as the essential formula for longevity where our health span equals our lifespan? You've given us so many ideas, but what would you say?
Mm. What comes to mind for optimal longevity for health span? People presence and purpose. Like spend the greatest amount of time as you can surrounded by people who you cannot get enough of. Be present in whatever your life is offering up to you, um, and engage in something that allows you to feel some sense of purpose along the way, whether that's an interaction, a conversation, a big thing, a little thing. I feel like those three things are just so key to our ability to not just being alive, but to living well.
Jonathan, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. And yeah, I love talking to you. I could talk to you all day long. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really been fun.
Oh, thank you.